Hello from the Channel studio in London and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches. I'm Tenyola Uyitayo. On the programme this week, a humanitarian emergency unfolds in the Gaza Strip as aid agencies warn of imminent famine. Plus, amidst one of the world's largest human displacements, Sudanese refugees face grueling wait in overcrowded South Sudan camps. As the conflict in the Gaza Strip approaches its fifth month, life has become incredibly challenging for many. Over 1 million displaced Palestinians are crammed into the southern city of Rafah, forced to seek shelter there. They endure squalid conditions in makeshift shelters with limited access to safe drinking water and food. Aid agencies caution that without intervention, Gaza could face conflict-induced famine.
Displaced and desperate, tens of thousands of Gazans are homeless with nowhere to go and nothing to eat. Rafah, an area 20% the size of Gaza, currently hosts more than 1 million people. Muad Swalem lives in this tent with 17 family members. They all sleep on the floor. They have been displaced 3 times since October the 7th, when they fled their homes with only the summer clothing they wore. They sold what little they had to buy the tent and now have no money to buy essentials like diapers.
There's no milk, no food, no drink like normal people. I lost 25 kilos in 1 month only. We can't go on with this. We can't do anything. Look at this rain. The children here in this modern puddles. We can wash their clothes. We can find water to drink. Bread and canned food is expensive. Everything is expensive.
Most food is distributed in Rafah and very little assistance reaches people elsewhere. The shortage of food, clean water and medical assistance is particularly severe in the northern areas to which access has become almost impossible.
So every time a family is displaced, they become more and more desperate, they lose some more resilience. And that's really a consideration when we are so worried about the threat of famine across the Strip. We know we can't reach everybody right now. It's impossible to get into the north.
Aid agencies have accused Israel of hampering aid deliveries into Gaza and say the military has prevented distribution outside southern areas around Rafah.
IDPs face acute shortages of food, water, shelter and medicine. Communicable diseases are rising amid unsanitary conditions, and over 2 million people face extreme food insecurity, with women and children at greatest risk. This desperation and scarcity has led to a near total breakdown in law and order.
2/3 of Gaza's population was already dependent on humanitarian assistance even before this war. The sudden cut in food supply has led to catastrophic levels of hunger in an extremely short time.
That this catastrophic famine and genocide has been allowed to happen at all and allowed to continue for this long brings shame on all of us, not least this Security Council that continues to fail to demand a ceasefire and ensure respect for international law and for its own resolutions, leaving the Palestinian people to the mercy of the occupying power that has zero regard for its IHL obligations to ensure the safety and well-being of the civilian population under its control, choosing instead to terrorize, kill, maim, displace, and starve them.
How can it be that Israel is libelously held responsible for a situation that is clearly the UN's fault? The conduct of the UN in the field must be streamlined and humanitarian aid must be distributed more effectively. This is the solution. Israel is committed to improving the humanitarian situation in the northern part of Gaza as well. Accordingly, Yesterday, Israel permitted and facilitated the airdrops of 64 Jordanian and French food packages throughout northern Gaza. The UN, on the other hand, has refused to deliver aid to this area. UN agencies' decision to suspend the distribution of aid to northern Gaza is not only counterproductive, but harmful to the Palestinian civilian population, and it's also used as yet another way to demonize Israel.
Meanwhile, Gaza's hospitals have become a focal point of the nearly 5-month-old war between Israel and Palestinian militant group Hamas. Just 13 of the Palestinian enclave's 34 hospitals are functioning on a partial or minimal level. Nasser Hospital, Gaza's second largest medical facility, is the latest to be put out of action, forcing the evacuation of patients.
It's an exhausting job because we are working 24/7. We have a shortage of staff. We only have 5 or 6 healthcare workers, including nurses and doctors, trying to do providing health like medication, dressing. In addition of all that, distributing food to the patient, making the cleaning, and also bidding for the patients.
I never thought that this would actually be happening in a hospital. I never thought that I would ever be trying to evacuate or refer patients from the hospital, taking patients from a tertiary hospital to a field hospital. That have never crossed my mind. But it's happening. It's not safe for them to stay there. They don't have the quality of care, the medical care that they deserve and they need. So that's why we keep on going and bringing them here and there, because they deserve this care.
Israel has raided medical facilities, alleging that Hamas keeps weapons and hostages in hospitals. Hamas operates across densely populated Gaza but denies it uses hospitals for cover. Many in the international community have said hospitals must be protected in line with international law.
The health and humanitarian situation in Gaza is inhumane and continues to deteriorate. Over the past 3 days, WHO and partners have carried out several emergency missions to Nasser Medical Complex in southern Gaza. Around 130 sick and injured patients and at least 15 doctors and nurses remain in the hospital. With the intensive care unit no longer working, WHO has helped move patients, many of whom cannot even walk. On a broader level, Gaza has become a death zone. Much of the territory has been destroyed. More than 29,000 people are dead. Many more are missing, presumed dead, and many, many more are injured. Severe malnutrition has shot up dramatically since the war started, from under 1% to more than 15% in some areas, putting more lives at risk. This figure will rise the longer the war goes on and supplies are interrupted. We note with apprehension that the World Food Programme cannot get into northern Gaza with supplies.
Humanitarian law is very clear. Healthcare workers and healthcare facilities are off limits. They must not be attacked. They must not be used for military purposes. They must be protected at all times. Protection of healthcare also includes the prohibition against combatants using health facilities for military purposes. But IHL is also clear that even if healthcare facilities are being used for military purposes, there are stringent conditions which apply to taking action against them, including a duty to warn and to wait after warning. And even then, disproportionate attacks are strictly prohibited.
Israeli troops and Palestinian gunmen clashed throughout the Gaza Strip over the weekend as mediators picked up the pace of talks on a possible ceasefire to free hostages held by Hamas and halt military activities in Gaza for the Muslim holy month of Ramadan.
I made it clear.
United States President Joe Biden says he hopes for a ceasefire by next week. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says at least 29,000 people have been killed in the war. Israel's retaliatory campaign came after Hamas-led gunmen attacked Israel on the 7th of October, killing at least 1,200 people and taking 253 hostages.
South Sudan is dealing with the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees from its northern neighbor, Sudan, which has been in the grip of a major conflict between the government and the Rapid Support Forces since April of last year. The United Nations warns that the conflict has caused one of the world's largest human displacements. A new batch of refugees arrive in the South Sudanese town of Rank. Their exhausted faces betray the strain of their traumatic journey out of war-ravaged Sudan.
We came by bus. It took us 2 days to get here. We came from Sudan because of the war, to look for a place to stay and settle. What we need is food. The immediate support we need is to eat to be able to survive.
They're among more than 500,000 people who have crossed the border into South Sudan, which is struggling to accommodate the new arrivals.
Well, the conditions here are extremely harsh. There's hardly any water, any food, any sanitation, any security, any shelter. It's also one of the most remote areas in the country. Thousands of people have crossed the border just behind me from Sudan. Many of them are vulnerable, many of them are traumatized. We've spoken to women, we've spoken to children and the elderly who fled the terrible violence and have spent weeks, in some cases months, trying to reach this border, trying to cross into South Sudan to reach safety.
Rank is just 10 kilometers from Sudan, where fighting broke out in April last year between Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his former deputy Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, commander of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. Since the start of the conflict, nearly 8 million people, half of them children, have fled Sudan. Around 560,000 of them have taken refuge in South Sudan, according to the United Nations, which estimates that around 1,500 new arrivals turn up in the country every day. Many spend months waiting in the transit camps, hopeful that someday soon they will be able to return home.
There are massive concerns about the risk of disease, of hunger, and of further violence. This is one of the most remote places on earth. There's hardly any infrastructure in this area. There's no mobile or internet network of any kind in this area. There is no food supply in this area. There is no water in this area. So the risks and the concerns about diseases spreading are real.
The war has claimed lives of thousands of civilians, according to UN figures. Around 25 million people, more than half of Sudan's population, need humanitarian assistance. Aid agencies are struggling to meet the dire needs of families exhausted and traumatized after walking for days with little food and water.
While not receiving much international media attention, is witnessing a humanitarian catastrophe. More than 10 months of conflict have had a deadly impact on the lives, livelihoods, and health of the people. Over 6 million people have been displaced internally, and nearly 2 million people have gone to neighboring countries. This is the largest displacement of people in the world. Half the population needs humanitarian aid, but partners cannot reach most of them. Already more than 14,000 people have been killed, And if the world turns a blind eye to the suffering in Sudan, many more will die.
With up to 10 trucks and buses turning up in rank every day, the United Nations is trying to mobilize the international community, launching an appeal for $4.1 billion to respond to the most urgent humanitarian needs. Since the escalation of the war over 2 years ago, Ukrainian families have endured displacement, loss, and relentless violence. Children in frontline areas suffer from disrupted schooling, healthcare, and social services, leading to a mental health and learning crisis, according to UNICEF. As air raid alerts sound above, children in cities in Ukraine's frontline areas have been forced to spend between 3,000 and 5,000 hours, equivalent to between 4 and almost 7 months, sheltering in basements and underground metro stations over the past 2 years. The United Nations Children's Emergency Fund says this has had a devastating impact on children's mental health and ability to effectively learn.
So the ongoing shelling, the increased use of drones, all this is building into an awareness that children continue to be killed. And so it's hindering families' capacity to overcome the deep stress and trauma inflicted by this war. Parents across Ukraine report that their children are suffering from excessive fear, anxiety, sleeplessness, phobias, sadness. And so at a time when parental care is needed most, half of those parents surveyed reported that they are struggling to support their children.
According to the Ukrainian government, more than 3,800 educational facilities in the country have been damaged or destroyed, severely interrupting access to education for millions of children. Only 2 out of 700 schools in Kharkiv are delivering in-person learning. Most children are studying online. Others attend classes in 5 metro stations that have been converted into underground schools.
Ukraine is now the most mined country on the planet. So when we talk about childhood being robbed, no socialization, no school, no ability to play in those areas. We have trained 5,000 counsellors and supporters to do mine risk education, which is now a part of the curriculum thanks to the government. But the attacks continue. The isolation in bunkers continue. And as such, the attritional nature of this war is not just being played out on the front lines in the battlefields, but in families' lives, in families' homes.
The biggest needs, I would say, is in rural areas where it's very hard to access basic services. Incomes are lower, and we have sort of families who have split up, and as I mentioned, sort of older people, disabled people are the ones that are most vulnerable. Recovery is the way to go, and so we have not only many hospitals, rehabilitation centers, schools that have been destroyed, for which some minimal repairs can make a difference. But we also need to do recovery in people's health and their livelihoods and their well-being. It's time for us now as an international community to be investing in this more comprehensive way instead of just relief items.
The United Nations Charter.
2 years on, the UN Secretary General says the war in Ukraine is an open wound at the heart of Europe.
The United Nations Charter and international law are our guides to creating a world free from the scourge of war. Yet, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine directly violated both. 2 years on, and a decade since Russia's attempted illegal annexation of Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, the war in Ukraine remains an open wound at the heart of Europe. It is high time for peace, a just peace based on the United Nations Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. In any war, everyone suffers. But the people of Ukraine are suffering appallingly from the war inflicted on them by Russia. Over 10,500 civilian men, women, and children have been killed, though the true figure is likely higher. Damage and destruction of hospitals, schools, health facilities and civilian infrastructure is frequent and intensifying. 90 education and healthcare facilities were damaged or destroyed in January alone. And amidst the brutal winter, over 380 towns and villages across the country were without electricity early this month, according to the Ukrainian energy company. The United Nations has documented widespread and disturbing brutality.
Also addressing the United Nations Security Council on the anniversary of the war, the British Foreign Secretary warned the UN about the consequences of withdrawing support for Ukraine.
The only people behaving like Nazis are the Putin regime, invading another country and hoping the world will be weak and let you get away with it. That is the simple truth. Putin believes he can take territories, redraw borders, exercise force to build his empire. We must all stand up to Putin, not just out of sympathy to Ukraine, but because his actions in Ukraine are so dangerous for everyone else. If we give in to the idea that one country can invade another with impunity, then we will be left in a dreadful situation where any country could face a similar fate.
Russia, on its part, repeated claims that Moscow is not responsible for the war and that it's simply protecting Russian-speaking populations who were allegedly discriminated against by Kyiv. While Ukraine's foreign minister sought to rally more international support.
We continue to insist that Russia has no legal right to be present at this table, and the future reform should correct this historic mistake that led to deadly consequences. Ukraine wants peace more than any other nation. However, we are not going to allow Russia to kill us freely on the road to peace. Nor will we ever accept any offer to surrender or to concede our lands and freedoms under the guise of peace. Not only because it will make futile the ultimate price we are paying now for 2 years in a row, but also because we will all be doomed to pay a much higher price in the future.
The conflict has turned into an exhausting war of attrition and has been in a stalemate for several months now.
President Putin's aim to dominate Ukraine has not changed. And there are no indications that he is preparing for peace. But we must not lose heart. Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable skill and fierce determination again and again. Ukraine did not collapse in weeks, as many feared it would. You have recaptured half of the territory seized by Russia, pushed Russian back from large part of the Black Sea and inflicted heavy losses on the Russian forces. Above all, Ukraine retains its freedom and independence.
The war's had an immense impact on Ukraine's civilian population. Over 10,000 civilians have been reportedly killed since February the 24th, 2022. Immense humanitarian needs persist as the war continues to displace civilians and reduce access to education, economic opportunities, healthcare, and food security. And that's the program today, but remember our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelstv.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Tenyola Oyetayo. Bye for now.